Hi everyone and welcome back. Okay, so bit of a funny video this one. It's kind of a drawing and painting demo I guess, but it's mainly to talk about a bit of a disaster I had with the paper. And I just wanted to share this with you so that you can avoid it, if this happens to you. Now, generally speaking, most artists on YouTube only post their best work, their best finished paintings and drawings, and you never really get to see any of the disasters or all the things that go wrong or anything like that. You just see, the life of rainbows and unicorns and nothing ever goes wrong. And it's kind of a bit of a false illusion really, because, I have tons of mistakes, things go wrong, sometimes it's my fault, sometimes it's not. But in this case, it was kind of my fault and kind of wasn't. Now what it is, I've started to stretch my paper. I used to stretch my paper when I very first started painting watercolours over 30 years ago. And just recently, in the last few months, I've started to stretch my paper again. After many years of not stretching it and just generally taping it or clipping it to a board. Now, I've never really encountered the problem that I've encountered here before, other than when I've used really old or vintage watercolour papers. Now, what happened was, I stretched this piece of paper, and it's Milford watercolour paper, £140 cold pressed. I stretched it on this board, and I had it sitting on the board for about 3 months before I decided to actually paint something on it. Now, I don't usually wait 3 months before, I use a piece of stretched paper, but what I do is I'll stretch a batch of them all in one go. So maybe 3 or 4 of them, and this was the last one to get used up. It was one of the largest sizes that I'd got stretched, so I didn't really have much of a use for it. I generally work on sort of A4 sized watercolour paper, and this is a 1/4 imperial sheet. So after doing the pencil drawing and the line work on there, and then starting to paint it, I wet the paper all over with clean water, and as you can see here, I'm starting to apply, the sky colours, and the paper's nice and wet, as I always start most of my watercolour painting, so nothing different there. Everything was going fine and nothing looked unusual, and I thought, okay, these clouds are looking a little bit linear. I'll try and maybe use a bit of dry brush and remove some of the paint to create a few clouds. First thing I noticed, the paint wouldn't lift, which is quite strange because the paint usually lifts really well on Milford. But can you see there, look where I've just pointed with the end of the brush? It looks like granulation is starting, but what it actually is, the sizing has broke down on the paper. It wasn't left soaking for too long before I stretched it, it wasn't that at all. But what I think it was the fact that it was left on the board for 3 months. Once it had been thoroughly soaked, left to dry, and it was just leaning on the side of the wall, the side of my cupboard, just there for 3 months. And I think what's happened is that once the paper has been soaked and left to dry, it starts a reaction with the sizing on the paper, and it starts to break down and deteriorate. The sizing is not in the same condition that it left the factory in. The sizing has now been soaked for a while, and the paper allowing to stretch and tighten up again, and then just left out in the air, not in direct sunlight or anything, but just generally left out, and the sizing has just slowly started to deteriorate to the point where it's causing this granulation effect on the paper. It's clearly not granulation because the marks are too big, they're too big and blotchy. What's happening is a lot of the sizing has been removed, particularly when I've gone over it with water to re-wet the paper ready for the painting and started applying washes. The more water and brush strokes I'm putting on there, the more I'm brushing away and removing the sizing on the paper. Now, after I'd put the sky wash in, I'd kind of decided to give up on the painting. I wasn't going to continue with it because I just knew the whole thing was going to be a disaster. But I was filming this for a project on Patreon, and I thought, well, just for the fun of it, I'll keep going and see what happens and just see what it dries like. By this time, the surface of the paper wasn't like watercolour paper at all. It was it was like painting on a tea towel or a piece of tissue or something like that. It was just horrible to paint on. But as you can see there, look, now it's all dried out. A lot of that blotchiness has gone. But that wasn't the end of the problem. In fact, it was just the start of a load more problems. Because now the paper's been re-wetted everywhere, lots of paint been applied, wet into wet, paper's allowed to dry, and now I'm going in with a second layer. There's hardly any sizing left on the paper at all. And what's happening now is where I want a nice fine line or a straight edge or something like that, the paint is just feathering out. You know, if you've ever used ink on paper that's not very suitable and you've got those kind of feathered edges where the ink kind of just bleeds out into the paper and it looks a real mess, that's exactly what was happening here on the watercolour paper. Now, as I'm painting the roofs in and the chimneys in and everything, it wasn't too bad, you know, for the first layer in that area. But trying to go in with a second layer on top of that was just disastrous. Like I say, it was like painting on a tea towel. The watercolour was just bleeding out, couldn't keep a straight edge anywhere. Everything was looking blotchy and not very nice. So what I decided to do was cut my losses and just give everywhere a very light wash and try not to keep sort of reworking areas, because my initial plan with this painting was to use lots of glazes. I wanted to really put some nice dark foreground shadows in, lots of glazes and that middle distance, lots more shadow, lots more contrast, but it just would have been a disaster. So I thought, okay, let's quit while we're ahead. We'll keep this as just a very simple light wash, pencil and wash painting, and just kind of leave it at that. Because the more washes I was putting on there, the worse the paper was behaving, the more it was feathering out on the edges, the more blotchy it got. And basically, you know, the more layers you're putting on, the more you're washing away any sizing. Not that there's hardly any left on there anyway. But there was just no chance of really progressing this painting into something nice. So like I say, quit while you're ahead. I learnt my lesson with that one. Never leave the paper on the board for a long period of time once it's been stretched and soaked and everything, because there's some kind of reaction that happens where over time that sizing breaks down. Now I don't know if this is going to be the case on all papers or if it's just something that happens on Milford paper, but I just wanted to make this video just to let you know, if you're stretching your paper, don't leave it too long on the board. But anyway, there we go, that's the finished disaster or finished painting or whatever you want to call it. Like I say, I quit while I was ahead, and it dried out okay, but when you get close you can really see those feathered edges on there. Anyway, thanks very much for watching. If this video was helpful to you, I would really appreciate a like, and I always read your comments, and take care everybody, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.